Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third event of our series on the role of economic growth in a green transition. I'm Sophie from the Decarbonize Future Economy Forum, and it is my greatest pleasure that I will be guiding you through the event this evening. For those of you who don't know the Decarbonize Future Economy Forum, we aim to explore pathways on how to decarbonize the economy. For this, we bring together global thought leaders with a wide range of approaches and provide them with a shared platform to discuss their ideas. Now, some of you might have already joined us for our first two events. There, we discussed green growth ideas with Professor Ottmar Edenhofer and Professor Hepburn. And we also heard about degrowth and post-growth economics from Professor Tim Jackson, Professor Susan Paulson, and Catherine Trebek. We learned that there really are some fundamental differences in their views, especially on capitalism and the role of economic growth. Yet, how I understand, both approaches aspire towards the same goal, which is fighting climate change and paving the way toward a truly sustainable future. And the time is ticking. So this why in this third event, we pose the questions, are both approaches as irreconcilable as they seem? And is there a way how we can move forward so we're not losing ourselves in ideological divides? I am beyond excited. We will hear from two outstanding scholars tonight to find some answers to these questions. Professor Daniel Fiorino and Beth Stratford. A big and warm welcome to the both of you. Now, while each of you is probably more inclined toward one or the other approach, we find that your work is really well suited to discuss frictions and establish commonalities. Both will give a short impulse presentation with their key messages in the first half of our event. After that, we'll have time for discussion between the panelists with questions from the audience. Since this is a webinar, participants are muted and without video. But we are really excited to hear from all of you. So please do a Q&A function where you can ask your questions and also upvote or comment on others' questions. If you wish, you can also add your name and the name of the organization you work for, but you don't have to. Finally, this event is being recorded and the recording will be published afterwards on our website. Now, without further ado, let me introduce Professor Daniel Fiorino, who will give the first impulse presentation. Hello, Dan.
Hello, Sophie, and thank you for the opportunity to speak with this group today. Thanks to the Decarb Future Economy Forum. What you're doing is obviously very important. And it's great to have these forums to discuss these issues.
Thank you, Dan. So is joining us from the United States today, where he is the founding director of the Center for Environmental Policy, distinguished executive resident in the School of Public Affairs, and faculty member in the Department of Public Administration and Policy at American University. Previously, he has for many years served in a variety of senior positions at the US Environmental Protection Agency. He has authored and co-authored 7 books and over 50 journal articles, which have received over 4,000 citations. So I believe it is safe to say here that you really are a thought leader on environmental and climate governance. In his most recent book, A Good Life on a Finite Earth, The Political Economy of Green Growth, he makes the case for a green economy. He argues that the green economy allows for a positive sum relationship between economy and ecology, and therefore provides a third way to business as usual or degrowth. Based on his book, Dan will speak on the green economy, prospect or pipe dream. Dan, please take it away.
Great, thank you. And let me just make the appropriate conditions here, and we'll get underway. So the word green is used a lot these days, and there's a reason for that. We recognize that we are facing some very clear planetary limits. So I always like to start with that, the idea of planetary limits, and we can call them boundaries. I mean, there's a lot of work now on planetary boundaries, constraints, but for my purposes, the fact is that if we look at climate change or a wide range of other issues, there are limits to the pressures that human populations, and particularly economic growth, the sheer scale consumption of modern economies put in the environment. So Sophie mentioned a good life on a finite earth. So that opportunity to explore the relationships between economic and political factors. So I often start with this. I have a few slides today from a report from the World Resources Institute. The report is America's New Climate Economy, which I think is an excellent example of green economy thinking. So it focuses on climate change and factors that are adding to emissions, but it builds very much an economic case. So this is, we're all very familiar with this. This is the United States. The upper line is GDP, which has steadily increased, of course, over the years, and the lower line is CO2 equivalent emissions. So I would call this an example of decoupling, where emissions, the environmental impact that we're concerned about, is not in lockstep, not a one-to-one relationship with economic growth. On the other hand, it's not getting to where it needs to be. So ideally, we would need absolute decoupling, where the bottom line would approach zero, which economically and technologically and in terms of behavior, I think is very doable. Middle of the century, we're now aiming for carbon neutral global economy, but this helps set the stage, I think, very nicely. So the basic logic is that we are in a collision course with planetary limits. Changes in the climate system, degradation of habitat, damages from urban air pollution, water stress and shortages. I mean, on and on. We know that we are increasingly stretching the limits of planetary capacities, which have really important implications for human well-being. So those who say, well, economic growth is the priority, well, if that is your priority, you need to be concerned about these limits, because we're going to see that issues like climate change are really undermining the capacity to pursue our economic goals and our social goals as well. And I think my conception of the green economy has a very social element, social equity piece to it. So I think we all understand this, or probably most of you wouldn't be listening to this program. So there's some pretty big options. Now, these aren't mutually exclusive. We're going to maybe draw on elements of all these, but I see four sort of big mega strategies that we could follow. One is, I guess, degrowth captures the concept pretty well. We have a deliberate degrowth or slow down growth, but usually to have an impact, people speak in terms of reducing the size of global economies. So countries, particularly the more affluent countries in the world, would deliberately slow down or reverse economic growth rates. I see a number of very practical issues. I see a number of equity issues with this approach. And it's hard to imagine how this will happen. It doesn't mean that we don't need to pay attention to lifestyles or the impacts of growth, but a sort of degrowth, shrinking economic scale, I think that's a huge distraction. from some of the other choices that have to be made. Of course, another option is what John Dryzek calls in his book, The Politics of the Earth on Environmental Discourses, the Promethean discourse, which is, well, we'll figure it out. The more technology, the more people, the more economic success that we have, the more likely we will figure out these issues. And I would say an extreme version, we have just seen an extreme version of that in the United States. Some of you are seeing it in your countries, but certainly the Trump administration was an example of growth is great. That will triumph above everything else. I think that's a very dangerous and harmful and destructive path. So certainly technology will play a role, but it won't be the absolute solution. Another option is largely what most industrialized countries have done in the past half century or so, especially in the United States, where we say, well, we're going to reconcile growth and ecology. So we'll sort of minimize the negative. So we'll find ways to use coal to generate electricity, or use oil and diesel fuel to fuel our transportation systems, but we'll find technology and other solutions that will help minimize the impact. And we'll still need some of that, but I think that does not get us where we need to go. The fourth is take this potential zero sum, and certainly critics of environmental and energy policy turn it into a zero sum where energy and environment and economy are inevitably in conflict, but look for a sort of the green growth, the green economy option. So I'm going to focus largely on that fourth category where I think there's some big options. So the themes of a green economy, I'll move quickly over this, but absolutely the effect of economic growth as we have seen it to this point is to increase pressure on the environment, particularly the way we've done it with fossil fuel-based energy, with industrial agriculture, with synthetic chemicals, on and on. We see this effect. Second, the negative impacts of environmental policies on economies overall are overstated. If you look at a lot of the analysis, it shows that environmental regulation, environmental policy has a very minimal effect on economic growth. We lose jobs here, we gain them somewhere else. In general, the green economy literature tells us that, at least if we look at something like clean energy, energy efficiency and renewable energy, and mass transit and those sorts of options are much more productive in terms of employment and job opportunities. But certainly economic arguments are used to oppose green policies. The third, the ecological impacts of growth are not all negative. In fact, there are some positive impacts of growth, so we want to at least recognize those and build on those. For example, as societies become more affluent, rates of population growth decline, of negative population growth in some parts of the world. More money can be available for investment, more capital moving into green sectors. So overall growth as it has been pursued to this point increases planetary stress, but there are some other aspects of that can be positive. So we want to be aware of those. And finally, the debates about growth versus ecology, I think that oversimplifies. I use the example of we could reduce the size of the US economy by 20%. If we did that alone, have fair effect, I think, over the long term on all these different planetary pressures that we have to really, we can think about growing in smarter ways or different kinds of growth or slowing growth and so on. But we have to really think about sort of changing the trajectory, looking at the ecological consequences of growth. So I've sort of referred to some of these points and I won't dwell on them, but the heart of of a green economy approach for me is that synergies exist among these various social goals, and that we have to find them and implement them. And I'll show you very briefly in a few minutes how energy efficiency does this. Energy efficiency is sort of the classic case where we can find these kinds of win-win opportunities. Some degree of economic growth, I think, can occur within the midst of global ecosystems, at least for a time. I think a green economy is feasible. And ultimately, for all-time green economy, that's another question. It's a matter of good policies, good investments, sometimes behavioral change, although we found those are very difficult to make in most parts of the world. And I think that green growth can be achieved in ways that are compatible with democratic values. So I don't think we need to necessarily democracy to be able to make these kinds of choices, but it is admittedly very different. And I will skip 2 points, but as I did more work on the green economy concept, you know, there are sort of critics from the left side of the political spectrum, many valid points, but I think we can deal with these. And of course, points from the right side of the political spectrum, which I think have less of a foundation, frankly. But we see these in the United States, where one of the two major political parties is, I would say, very much in the Promethean mindset or something very similar to that. So the claims are that green policies, clean energy undermine the potential for future growth. The evidence says, well, actually, no, we see the reverse. It puts national economies at a disadvantage. That, I think, can be an issue, which is why global action and global cooperation, particularly in the short term, can be important. Politics driven by the short term, I think that's a challenge that we all face. We want to think long term, you know, over the course of the next decade or two or longer, but political systems operate in the short term, so that certainly is an issue. A frequent criticism in the US that it's merely a path for you know, anti-market, pro-regulation, extreme liberal agenda. So there certainly are political criticisms from various parts of the political spectrum, and we want to be aware of those. Just to give you an idea of some of the policy tools that I think are important for a green economy, I'm a big believer in pricing resources appropriately. The reason that we have environmental problems is that, or a big reason, I mean, you can say there are moral and ethical and other reasons, but certainly in economic decision-making, we don't attach value to, unless government intervenes, to things like pollution and carbon dioxide and methane and those kinds of issues. So I think we can do that. We need to do it in ways that are fair and equitable, and I think that is a challenge, but that's a good option. Subsidies are terribly damaging. Right now, depending on how you calculate them, but you know, anywhere from $500 million on up, depending on the methodology, of fossil fuel subsidies around the world. And those certainly providing incentives for brown economic behavior. I've done a lot of work on how can we design regulation to be demanding and stringent, but predictable and flexible. Investment, a little later, I'll just give you a quick look at the Biden infrastructure proposal because it's an illustration of scaling up public investment in economic sectors that will deliver environmental and energy reform. Integrated policy sector, certainly if we really want to have a green economy, we need to integrate decision-making, whether it's natural resources or manufacturing policy or economic policy or tax issues. We want to integrate ecological and energy considerations into all aspects. And I think there's potential to use valuation of ecosystem services to build in some recognition of the value of natural systems and economic decision-making. So this, I will wrap up in a minute here. Energy efficiency to me is a classic green economy issue. Reduce costs, paying less for energy. You're obviously helping the climate. We know that clean energy investments generate more employment per dollar invested than other options, certainly than fossil fuels. We get cleaner air, healthy society, potentially improved equity if we do it right, by lowering energy burdens, by improving air quality, and we can generate a lot of efficient technologies. So this is, just to give an illustration, this is not the compromise now that they're working on, but the Biden, our president's infrastructure proposal. So you see it, the idea here is to invest in things that will reduce negative impacts on the environment. So various clean energy and other kinds of things. Eliminating lead pipes is a tremendous, that number is going to be smaller, but something that can go to that can have really tremendous health and equity and other payoffs. So just some illustrations of some of these things. Finally, these are just a few quick slides to illustrate a little more green economy thinking. And these are from the World Resources Institute report, America's New Climate Economy. This compares some work by an economist that shows how clean energy jobs generate more employment than fossil fuel jobs. This, another way of looking at it, a description of the negative impacts on the US economy of various levels of average temperatures. So obviously, the higher we go in the range, the higher the costs. So a clear example that if you're thinking in smart ways about the economy, you want to think about these kinds of issues. And these are just some comparisons from the report that in general conclude that you're really not losing economic growth. You're just getting much better economic growth with more equity and a number of other goods. I will conclude there and turn the program back over to Sophie.
Thank you very, very much, Dan, for this very interesting presentation and also for sharing your ideas on the green economy with us. I believe you really showed here how the green economy potentially provides a balancing middle way. And also it was very insightful to hear how the green economy is already starting to be implemented under the new Biden administration. So thank you very much for that. And before we move on to Beth's talk, I would like to ask you a question, specifically also on the book, because in your recent book, or from your recent book, I understand that you're proposing a growth agnostic green growth. And do you see any commonalities in this approach with the green growth side? Because I believe in the anti-growth side, there are also some proponents of a growth, as they call it, for example, Vandenberg. So do you see any commonalities there with your approach? You're muted, Dan.
Thank you. It's sort of a sliding scale in the sense that you can, and in the book, I say, yeah, maybe we have to rethink growth. I look at a lot of the happiness literature, interestingly, which says, well, you know, having more money or having higher per capita incomes beyond, up to a certain point, yes, it can deliver more happiness, but beyond a certain point, there are not only ecological effects, but some socially adverse effects of too much growth. So and I teach a class on environmental sustainability, and I say sustainability ultimately is philosophy, because it's about what kind of world you want to live in and what kind of life you think is appropriate. So I think we can think about ways of modifying growth patterns or limiting growth and do it in much greener ways. I'm just the the view that, well, we're going to solve these problems, limiting or reversing growth, I think is unrealistic. But yeah, I do see a lot of commonality.
Okay, thank you very much. It sounds very much also like the well-being economy that a lot of degrowth proponents propose. Well, I'm sure or hope we have time to discuss this later in the Q&A. I see we already have a few questions, so please keep them coming. So we have lots to discuss in the Q&A. But for now, let's move on to our second speaker, which is Beth Stratford. Welcome, Beth.
Hi there.
Beth is joining us from the UK today, where she is an ESRC-funded PhD researcher working with Dan O'Neill at the University of Leeds. Her research interests are post-growth political economy, land and housing market reform, as well as money and finance. Her PhD research focuses on the threat of rent extraction, resource and potentially constrained future. Beth is also a fellow at the New Economics Foundation, co-founder of the London Renters Union. And both of these institutions are really about how to organize economic change from the bottom up. So in addition to your academic expertise, you really are the expert here today about the campaigning and movement side of things. Beth also had a foray into filmmaking. So if you want to watch, for example, a very entertaining satire about carbon offsetting, I definitely do recommend checking them out. Recently, she authored two reports. The first is Land for the Many for the Labour Party, and the other one, the UK's report for donut-shaped recovery. And based on the latter, Beth will speak about the 4 key strategies for ending our growth dependency this evening. Beth, over to you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Sophie. You can hear me okay? I hope so. Perfect. Yeah. So yeah, we were asked very specifically to explore potentials for cooperation between green growth advocates and degrowth advocates. So what I've prepared is an outline of a strategy consisting of 3 planks here that I think should be able to keep people on sides of this debate happy. Maybe not the zealots, but I think everybody who's serious about environmental and social justice. I'll be very interested to see if I can convince Dan of this, who I think obviously comes from a more green growth optimistic position than I do. So the first element, plank in the strategy, is the Green New Deal, which I don't need to say very much about. It's a no-brainer. Everybody can see that we need massive investment in public transport, insulation, renewable capacity. We need, it's going to be good for jobs, good for people in fuel poverty, clean up the air, win-win-win. It's a no-brainer. Limits on resource use and waste. Now, note here, I'm not proposing limits on GDP. I'm proposing limits on resource use and waste. And I think one of the reasons that people get quite upset about the idea of degrowth is because they imagine it involving some kind of descending cap on national income. Now, as far as I know, there are no serious thinkers in the post-growth community who are proposing to try and control the market value of production and consumption at an aggregate level. Why not? Because it would be impractical, A. B, it doesn't really make sense, actually, to try and control a metric that is several steps removed from the biophysical impacts that matter to us, when we can design policies to directly control resources, habitat destruction, pollution, and so on. So even for degrowthers, GDP reduction is not an end in itself. Okay, it's considered a likely outcome of limits on resource use and waste, but the policy target, the end, is to protect the environment, obviously. So I'll come back to the case in a moment. A few introductory things about ending our growth dependency, which is the third plank I want to discuss. We're currently dependent on growth to maintain economic and political stability. If GDP flatlines or contracts, then our economies tend to topple into crises of unemployment, debt, inequality, real hardship. So it's really no wonder that policymakers remain occupied with this narrow economic metric, despite the very widespread consensus now that GDP is a poor measure of progress. And this preoccupation is not just a problem from the point of view of environmental policies. It's obviously the specter of shrinking GDP is used regularly to block environmental protections. But the visceral fear of economic contraction has also turned out to be a major impediment to the containment of the pandemic. Okay, it made governments all around the world very slow to impose public health measures and very eager to lift them in workplaces in particular, in spite of warnings from scientists. And similarly, the specter of shrinking GDP has been invoked all around the world to block food standards, to weaken labor rights, and so on. So I would argue that our dependence on growth is actually putting policymakers in a dangerous jacket. Because certain forms of economic activity imperil our health, imperil our well-being, we need our governments to have the confidence to scale back those activities without the fear of triggering an economic crisis. And we can only give them that confidence if we find a way to end our dependence on growth. Again, ending our dependence on growth does not foreclose the possibility of growth. Okay, it simply makes our economy more resilient in the face of economic contraction and economic shock. And so I would argue there should be nothing inherently objectionable about this strategy for those who are optimistic about green growth. But before I get into how and why I think we need to end our dependence on growth, let me just go back and say a little bit about limits. Now, obviously, scaling up the good stuff that we need, the public transport, home insulation, and so on, it's urgent and essential. But we also need policies to scale down the bad stuff. You don't need to be a degrowth advocate to understand that. If we don't have those policies, then we get this result here, which just shows, yes, we've had this renewables boom over the last decade, but the share of fossil fuels in final energy demand has remained pretty much unchanged over that decade. Why? Because we haven't had effective policies to discourage the growth in fossil fuel use. Similarly, you don't have to be a degrowth advocate to understand that efficiency gains on their own do not guarantee reductions in resource use at an aggregate level. In fact, the history of capitalism suggests that efficiency gains more often than not stimulate consumption, leading to higher resource use if we're not careful. It's important to think about what growth really means. So a growth rate of 2% may sound very modest, may sound very innocuous, but 2% growth over 35 years results in a doubling of the scale of the economy. So if you've doubled the scale of the economy, your efficiency gains to offset that have got to be even more ambitious. I just want to give you a couple of examples of how efficiency gains can end up stimulating more consumption. Here's the development of computer technology. Clearly, computers in 1946 required much more resources and materials and energy to build than they do in 2010. But does the computer industry as a whole have a higher material footprint now than then? Yes, it does. Why? Because the efficiency gains made computers affordable for many more people, and so consumption grew. But the rebound effect doesn't only happen in this direct way, okay? It can also happen in an indirect way. So think about this. We provide cheap, sustainable public transport. We insulate homes. The result, people save money because they don't have to run their own car anymore. They don't have to spend so much heating their homes. It's a real win, and it will have really big positive benefits for well-being, for meeting people's basic needs. But what are people going to do with money that they save on their transport, on their heating, and so on? They're going to spend it. They're not going to burn it, they're going to spend it. So there will be a rebound of some size. Whether that rebound is big or small depends on whether we've put limits in place at an aggregate level to prevent an increase at an aggregate level in resource use. So what we really need is a really robust, here's my family who are thinking about maybe their foreign holiday that they're now going to be, the second foreign holiday that they maybe can afford now. So what we really need is a really robust regime of resource caps, taxes, regulations that gradually tighten until countries in the global north, like the UK, are back within their fair share of ecological space. Now, for growth to be genuinely green, it has to take place within those limits. So if green growth advocates are opposing those limits, then that would suggest that their confidence about the feasibility of achieving green growth is disingenuous, or their commitment to environmental justice is disingenuous, one or other. So let me turn now to ending our dependency. I'm going to illustrate why, from a climate perspective, I think it's important for us to seriously the need to end our growth dependency. And to do so, I want to show you a graph from a recent article published in Nature by Lund Kaiser and Fred Lenson. I may be pronouncing names wrong, I apologize if so. Before I show you, I'm going to give you a little bit of background to this graphic. So 5 years ago, 5 years after the Paris Agreement, the IPCC did a report on meeting the 1.5 degree target, and they published a bunch of mitigation pathways for getting there. Now, all of those pathways assumed continued growth in GDP. And in order to achieve that growth whilst getting within the 1.5 degree target, they all had to rely on really, really ambitious and unprecedented changes to our economy and technology. Now, the ambition of those changes can be thought of as occurring on 3 dimensions. So first of all, decoupling of energy use from GDP. You've almost all seen the graph of world GDP over time fluctuating alongside use of energy over time fluctuating. You've seen how incredibly tightly correlated energy and GDP have been historically. So what these mitigation scenarios hope is that we can break that relationship, essentially. The second dimension of ambition is to renewables rollout. How quickly can we scale up renewables? And the third dimension of ambition is to do with drawing carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So this graphic I'll show you now, each of these dots represents a different mitigation scenario. And the position of the dots and the size of the dots indicates what scale of technological transformation is required in each of these dimensions. So if you move to the right on this horizontal accent, the more to the right the dot is, the higher the required decoupling between energy and GDP. So that's measured in average energy efficiency gains between 2020 and 2040. The higher the dot is on this vertical axis, the higher the required renewable deployment, measured as average annual increase of solar, wind, and other renewables between 2020 and 2040. So up here is higher renewable rollout ambitions. Over here is higher ambitions in terms of decoupling GDP from energy use. And the size of the dot tells you how much carbon dioxide they assume we can remove from the atmosphere using bioenergy, carbon capture and storage, reforestation, and so on. Now, the different color dots are different groups. All you really need to focus on is that only these dark green dots here relax the assumption of growth. The rest of them assume business as usual growth of 2.5 to 3.5% per year. Only these ones relax that assumption. And down here, this is the scary bit, right? Down here, this black squiggle and the black dots there, that shows you our historical trajectory. That's how well we've been doing with our ambitions on drawing carbon out of the atmosphere, on decoupling energy and GDP, and on rolling out renewables. Now, you don't need to be a degrowth advocate, I think, to recognize that there is quite a big risk involved with relying on these leaps in technological progress to get us to the 1.5 degree target. We know that renewables have a considerably higher material footprint than fossil fuels. So we have risks of metal supply shortages, of conflict with local communities around the world who are impacted by material extraction. The reliance on negative emission technologies, I mean, carbon capture and storage is extremely controversial because of the association with land use change, the negative potential on water use, food security, biodiversity, and so on. So, so what happens if we find that the negative emissions technologies can't be scaled up without terrible consequences for food security? And what happens if the rollout of renewables isn't as fast as we hope? What happens if it turns out that that tight relationship between GDP and energy can't be suddenly broken in the way that these scenarios hope? Well, in that case, we have a choice. We either tell our kids and the people around the world on the front line of climate change, well, sorry, we decided our concern was more important than you guys having a habitable home climate, or we need to adapt to lower levels of consumption. And to argue economic change is required to adapt to make our economy resilient in the face of economic contraction would actually be emancipatory for the majority of people who are currently suffering from precarity and exploitation under the current system. So this diagram is from this report, which Sophie mentioned, which I read recently, called The UK's Path to a Donut-Shaped Recovery. In it, we argue that to reduce our growth dependency, we need 4 strategies relating to jobs, rent extraction, debt crises, and the safeguarding of basic needs. So I'm gonna try and quickly run through these strategies, although I can see that I'm running out of time, so maybe some of this is saved for the Q&A. So why is it, so on the first one, jobs, why is it that we associate low levels of growth with rising unemployment? Well, automation and technological innovations over time allow produce the same amount with less people and time, creating the specter of robots stealing our jobs. And historically, we've relied on consumption growth in order to generate more work and avoiding unemployment. But of course, there is an alternative and more environmentally sustainable way to maintain employment, which is to share out the remaining work. So instead of using automation to drive down prices and sell more goods, companies could offer workers a shorter week, higher hourly pay rate. That's not a solution that profit-oriented companies are going to deliver of their own accord. Okay, it's going to require coordination, legislation, a major shift in the balance of power in workplaces, so that those who invest in their labor are no longer systematically excluded from decision-making, because historical reductions in working were only achieved through union bargaining and legislation, and they stalled when the balance of power in workplaces shifted away from workers. So in our report, we talk about how we can shift that balance again. The second strategy is about reducing rents. Okay, here, tackling rent extraction. Now, when political economists talk about rent, they don't just mean rents extracted by landlords. They're talking about economies that are extracted by anybody in the economy who controls scarce or monopolized assets. Okay, so whilst most people have to work to earn a living, people who own and control scarce assets, land and housing, energy infrastructure, utilities, finance, intellectual property, they have the power to extract unearned income at the expense of everybody else. But you can't have people accumulate that power to extract unearned income, taking a bigger share, a slice of the pie, if the pie itself isn't growing. So diffusing that power, extract rents, sizing unavoidable rents, which arise from unavoidable scarcity, it's probably one of the most important parts of escaping growth dependency. And this is a really big project, and in the report we talk about some baby steps that we could take as part of our recovery from COVID-19. I'll talk more about that in the Q&A if there's time. The threat of debt crises. Okay, debt is very difficult to pay down without growth, so we need a strategy for reducing the burden in our economy. And that could be shifting away from debt to equity financing. There's an incentive in our tax system to finance through debt, but that incentive could be removed. We have very irresponsible and inflationary and risky forms of lending by our banking sector, which could be reined in very easily. there's much more to say about that, but I don't want to take more than my fair share of time. So I'll just skip on to safeguarding basic needs. In the UK, many of our essential goods and services like social care, energy, water, transport, they're controlled by private, and our ability to access those services depends on our economic fortune. And that makes us really vulnerable if we fall on hard times. It also makes it almost impossible to introduce taxes because the poorest in our society are already struggling to cover the energy and fuel. So you raise the price and you make that problem a lot worse. So what can we do about that? Well, we can extend the principle of free public services, which we already have in many countries in healthcare and education, to other areas like childcare, adult social care, transport, water, energy, access to the internet, that everybody can access life's essentials. How do we pay for that? Well, taxation of is a big part of the answer, but we can also insist that those who use way more than their fair share of natural resources cover the cost of cover some cost as well. So a frequent flyer tax, for example, that helps to fund free bus travel. I could go on, but I'm gonna wrap up because I'm very aware of wanting to save time for questions and discussion. But yeah, basically those 4 changes I think could improve the resilience of our economy in the face of future shocks and substantially reduce the precarity experienced by millions of people under the current system. So there we go.
Thank you very, very much, Beth, for this very interesting presentation. I enjoyed it a lot. I think you showed 2 things really well. First, that we should move beyond the green growth and degrowth debate, and that both sides actually have a lot in common already. And second, I think you really provided some excellent examples here on how the idea of reducing economic growth is not really a frightening prospect, but it actually gives room for society to prosper. Before we dive into the audience questions, I would also like to ask you a question, which is also a bit critical, same for Dan. So green growth advocates, they argue that degrowth the degrowth ideas are politically unrealistic because people won't vote for it. And Dan also just said in his presentation that the problem is that politics operate such a short term. So do you think that degrowth advocates can learn from the green growth proponents here?
So I definitely agree that going around shouting, we want an end to growth, is not going to win any elections, right? But you might have noticed that all of those policies which I described, those strategies for reducing our growth dependence, can be justified without any reference to this wonky concept of growth dependence. You can, is there going to be a majority of people in favor of greater working time reduction? Yes. Is there going to be a majority of people in favor of protection and cancellation of unpayable debts? Yes. Is there going to be a majority of people in favor of free adult social care and free childcare and a reform to our energy tariff, that if you use less energy, you pay less per unit? At the moment in our economy, the less energy you use, the more you pay per unit, which is insane, right? So is there going to be a majority in favor of kind of progressive policies that make it possible for people to meet their basic needs regardless of their economic fortune? Yes. Reining in the power of landlords to exploit people. Like, these are really popular policies, okay? They have a fantastic side effect, which is that they make our economy, make us able to meet needs and deliver well-being without relying on continuous consumption growth. But I do think that they're easier to tell than just calling for an end to growth.
Well, thank you very much for this answer, Beth. And with this, I actually would also like to move on to the questions from the audience. I see we already have some questions. I just want to remind you that please write your questions in the Q&A and don't raise your hand. So the first question we have is, what commonalities are there between green growth and what commonalities sorry. What commonalities between green growth and regrowth are missed in antagonistic policy discussions? Maybe why don't you go first then?
Sorry, what the question was, could you give it that again?
So the question was, what commonalities between green growth and degrowth are actually missed in agnostic policy discussions?
Oh, I think a couple of things are missing. One is just a recognition of political realities. And I agree with Beth that there is this growth dependence, and to some degree, certain political interests have convinced people that that's the only way to make progress as a society, and there's a lot of work to be done on that. So I think some of the political realities are missed in some of these debates, and also some of the opportunities to really change how economies work. I think when you sort of reduce it to that level, you miss opportunities for understanding the role that renewable energy can play, or the challenges of integrating renewable energy into the electricity system, or some of the challenges of electrifying transportation and those kinds of issues. So I'd say, yeah, political reality, and then a lot of the sort of composition of the economy and the opportunities that are possible from that.
Thank you very much, Dan. I see we have a lot of questions, so I'm trying to go through all of them. There's actually a question for Beth. So the question is, contracting consumption in the north will reduce income in the south, where resources and labor come from. What safeguards are needed for environmental justice in the transition that you suggest?
Yeah, this is a really thoughtful and good question, because a lot of economies in the global south have been encouraged to follow this export-led path. And there's something very unfair about suddenly cutting off that source of income. I get that. There's also something very unfair about, about consumers in the global north appropriating ecological space that doesn't belong to them, which is what's happening now. And I think we also need to bear in mind that, I cannot remember the statistic. It's something like for every pound of aid that it travels from the global north to the global south, another £4 of aid, it flows in the direction in the form of debt repayments and other extractive activities. So some of these questions of justice need to be addressed through addressing the injustices in the trade system itself, and the systemic advantages that economies with stronger currencies, for example, and better bargaining power and more weight in the WTO have those trade relationships. But I don't think I've got a really great response to this question. I think it's a really good one, and it needs to be thought about really carefully.
Thank you, Beth. Dan, do you have something to add to that question?
The global inequities are obvious. If you're just looking at who contributed the CO2 equivalent emissions, and now who's going to be bearing the consequences of a striking inequity, and you could look at a number of other kinds of things. I think the rich countries have a real compelling interest in working to share technologies, providing capital, because increasingly we're all in the same boat. It's very obvious with climate change, but biodiversity and a number of other issues that we're all in a similar situation. And the pandemic underlines a lot of those commonalities. So I think there are opportunities and obligations for much more sharing of resources and technologies and capital and so on.
Yes, I think you already also presented it very well in your book. So thank you for that. I think we have another question for you, Dan. So what do you think is the role of fossil fuel subsidies, and how much do they matter in the US economies in their transition towards a system based on renewable energies?
Well, I think they're a big barrier, and certainly in the US, but I think around the world, fossil fuels impose all sorts of social costs on the world: pollution and climate and ecological degradation and so on. And we should be making it more difficult as a matter of public policy to use fossil fuels. Instead, fossil fuel subsidies are rewarding people. So it's like, it's the reverse of what we should be doing. So I think one of the first step in moving toward a clean energy system is eliminating those kinds of fossil fuel subsidies. I always tell students the first rule of politics is once somebody has gained a benefit, it is very difficult to take it away. And subsidies are a great example of that, where various interests will fight tooth and nail to protect their subsidies. And in many parts of governments use subsidies to mollify populations. But I think fossil fuel subsidies are a huge barrier to a clean energy transition, in short.
Yes, thank you very much. We have another question for Beth, which is about your concept of the donut strategy. So you say that pricing is difficult to implement because of the burden it puts on low-income households. But do you think that carbon pricing can be turned into kind of a progressive and therefore pro-poor policy by kind of redistributing the revenues equal per capita climate dividend?
Yeah, so this is an absolutely brilliant example of the redistribution of scarcity rents. Okay, so if we were to cap the amount of fossil fuels that could be extracted out of the ground or imported into any given economy, we would be bringing forward a scarcity that exists anyway, because those resources are finite, but we'd be deliberately bringing forward that scarcity in order to protect the climate. And therefore, we would, therefore, the auction of permits to extract those fossil fuels or import them would generate scarcity rents, would generate this revenue, which is based on the scarcity of those resources. Now, those resources belong to all of us. Nobody here created them. So we have an entitlement to share, right? And this, I mean, I'd like to see more work done on it. Of course, there are lots of different ways that you can go about sharing out and socializing unearned rents. But I think there's something simple and appealing about redistributing those revenues on an equal per capita basis. It certainly seems one way of creating a very large constituency in favor of carbon pricing straight away, because for a lot of people, having a spend of 500 quid or 1,000 quid or whatever it is, that would be a really big difference to their annual budget or monthly budget. I don't know how it would work out. So I definitely think that's the kind of thing that ought to be yes.
Okay, thank you very much. We actually have another question following up on that, and it's about valuing ecosystem services and kind of putting a price on them. And where do you think maybe the danger of doing that? I think you both have opposing views on that. So maybe Dan, why don't you go first?
Yeah, I know a criticism of valuing ecosystem services is that we're commodifying nature. So everything has a price tag, and I think that's a risk. That's why I would not use it as a strict decision rule. But I think we need to, it's all partly an educational goal where we need to educate people that, yeah, a wetland or a coastal estuary actually does important things for us. And people are used to, whether we like it or not, people are used to thinking very much in economic terms. So I think when we say, this is the value of this wetland, so, you know, you're destroying an asset, and it's a natural asset. There are different kinds of assets, but when you destroy this wetland, you're losing something important for everybody's well-being. I think there's value not as a strict decision rule where we sort of match up ecosystems against other investments, where we use them to appreciate the value and educate people that natural capital is a form of capital and it's an important well-being.
Can I come in on that question as well? Yeah. Yeah, so I think I absolutely get the challenge that we live in a world where prices speak, and people pay attention to prices in a way that they don't pay attention to more qualitative arguments. So I'm not completely opposed actually to the practice of trying to estimate monetary value, put monetary values on certain ecosystems, but the way you go about estimating the monetary value has a very big impact on the result that you get. So there was a paper by the ecological economics student paper a few years ago. A guy called Jasper Kenter went to, I can't remember, somewhere, maybe like an island in Indonesia or somewhere, or Papua New Guinea, I forget, where there was a community of people who was trying to elicit the value of the forest that they lived in. You know, how much would you need to be compensated to cut down an acre of this forest? You know, they asked them all individually, how much would you need to be compensated to lose this forest? You know, and they all kind of plucked a number. Oh, well, this is what I guess I would, you know. Then he went about it in a different way, and he got them to sit down and discuss and deliberate as a community. What would it mean as a community? What value does this forest play for us culturally, socially, in terms of supporting our entire livelihoods? And when the exercise was done in that way, the answer was entirely, they basically came with the answer that the forest is priceless. You can't, it doesn't matter, is actually, you can't cut down this forest. And so at the moment, the methodologies that are used by economists for estimating ecosystem can often be really, really dodgy, and they can be based on, you know, they can put a higher value on places that are tourist destination for rich people because, you know, or and so on. I won't go on about this because I can see Dan nodding there. You know, there are real difficulties with pricing things in a fair way, and one of the other risks is, I guess, is that it can give a false sense of certainty, like we actually have any idea how much this ecosystem is worth. You know, ecosystems are extremely complex, and sometimes we don't know what the value of a bug is. You know, this obscure tiny bug that lives in this ecosystem, we don't know what impact that's going to have on the entire food chain if it gets extinct. So there's a danger there, I think, of false arrogance coming from pricing mechanisms, but I suggest that there's no use in using them at all.
Yeah, I would agree. Willingness to pay is a very poor way, and you know, you go ask people what's the value, what would you pay to preserve this wetland? Well, they have no idea. I mean, it's sort of an impulse, and they're also biases in it. So if we do it, I think we want to really sort of understand, you know, what are the services they're performing, and use that to educate people. But I agree, just relying on I guess it's contingent valuation is pretty dodgy.
Well, thank you very much both. I think you can see some commonalities here, which was also the aim of the event. Unfortunately, our time is slowly coming to an end, but before we wrap it up, here, I want to ask both of you a final question. And that is, where do you like the green growth and degrowth debate to be heading toward? And what should proponents of both sides be doing now to join forces toward the same of a sustainable future for all? Why don't we hear first from Beth?
What I like both sides to be doing, I would like to see a little bit less of each side shouting at the other and calling it the other group naive, because you get that on both sides. We have not had that in this series of debates, which you very carefully curated for us. But you get on both sides, you know, like, oh, all of you green growthers, you're just techno fetishists who have no grasp of biophysical reality. And the other side, oh, all you degrowthers, you're just, you know, hippies and Luddites with no grasp of political reality. Well, truth on both sides. There's truth in both of those statements, right? Because actually, what's going to be required to save our asses is political changes that currently look completely unfeasible and unrealistic, and also technological changes that look at the moment completely unfeasible and unrealistic. It doesn't strengthen your argument to just point at the other and say, well, what they're suggesting to do is utopian. We have to be utopian. This isn't an either or situation, right? This is what I was trying to offer with this presentation. We throw everything that we have at technological change. We need to throw everything that we have at overcoming the vested interests who don't want the taxes on fossils, etc. And we need to throw everything that we have to reducing our growth dependence, so that if it turns out, as ecological economists generally believe, if it turns out to be the case that those environmental protections constrain growth, we need to be prepared for that. So that's kind of my point, is like, we need to do everything. And it would be cool if both sides could kind of support what the other side is working on, rather than detracting from the efforts of the other group.
Yeah, I would start with, do we have a shared vision of what kind of world we would like to see? You know, where the energy system doesn't destroy the climate and cause millions of deaths each year from air pollution and destroy ecosystems. I think there's a very strong case to be made, and I think this may be an area for connecting some of these different points of view, is starting with a focus on social and economic equity. I think levels of equity have increased in most developed countries. They absolutely have increased in the United States. And I think that's the root of a lot of our political problems at the moment. And I think opponents of a lot of clean environment and energy policies have used inequity, and in the United States, they've used race to pit different groups against each other, really obscure. Like when Beth, when you were talking about the number of things that where there would be a lot of agreement that these are good things, or lots of social investments of various kinds. I'm not so sure that they would be in the United States, because I think our politics has been so affected by these ideological camps and sort of the cross-cutting issues related to race and so on, that there wouldn't necessarily be agreement. But I say, what kind of world do you want to live in? What are the characteristics? And what's the role of sort of basic human dignity and economic and social fairness? And then maybe work from there. And I think we would see a lot of commonality.
Well, thank you very, very much to both of you. I believe these are very good words to end our panel. I also really like to ask more questions, and there are also more questions from the audience, but I'm afraid that we have to wrap up here since the time is coming to an end. It has been a real pleasure to hear from both of you and discuss such interesting questions from the audience. One key takeaway for me is really that maybe growth itself might actually not be the most important thing to focus on, but it's maybe more important what policies we make and we can take decisions as society. And also, I believe that it became very clear that both the green growth and the degrowth proponents are really support the same goal, which is establishing an economy within our ecological limits, and that also makes our society prosper. So I guess the urgency and the dimension of the task at hand really calls for moving beyond the ideological divides that we're seeing, and as Beth said, to really throw every we got. So in the name of the organizing team, I would like to say a really big thank you, Dan and Beth, for your time, for your interesting insights. I also want to thank my colleagues at the Decarb Future Economy Forum for this event, specifically Christiane, Lucas, Mariana, Paul, Niels, Alex, Simon, and everyone else who has been working very hard behind the scenes to bring this event to life. I would also like to thank our partners for the support. Thank you to the Think Lab of the Stiftung der Deutschen Wirtschaft and E.ON Stiftung for supporting us with the necessary funding. Thank you to the Center for Sustainability of the School of Governance Berlin for providing us with the technical infrastructure, and also to our academic partners, the Mercator Research Institute on Global Commons and Climate Change, and the SOE Institute for Future Fit Economies. So the Decarb Future Economy Forum is a student-run initiative. So if you are interested in our topics and organizing these kinds of events, please do get in touch via email at info@decarb.world. Finally, this was our last event before our little summer break, but do not despair. New events are already in the pipeline, where we will turn to practice by looking how policy and business have been adopting different growth paradigms. So stay tuned and follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn to be notified about upcoming events. And in the meantime, you can also visit our website at www.decarb.world, where you will also find the recording of today's event and written summaries of our past events. So thank you so very much, everyone, for your attention and for your engagement. And I wish you all a lovely evening. Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you for your excellent sharing, Sophie. And
Yes,
great,
well
great
done.
to meet you.
Thank you very much, both.
That was quite enjoyable, right, Dan?
Yes. Good issues. I like it when organizations that the ecological with the social, because I think they're all connected. We may have different ways of getting there, different points of view, but you can't separate sort of the social aspects from the ecological aspects of what's going on in the world.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. That seems to me to be a kind of more important dividing line in some ways. It's like people who care about economic justice and social justice, and people who don't care about that stuff, then the dividing line between those who are optimistic about green growth and those who are pessimistic about green growth.
Yeah, I agree. And you'll probably find a lot of commonality. What's scary these days